They called her the Fatal Bride, a vision in white, who buried every man she touched. In the seaside town of Ravenshollow, where the salt wind whispers secrets through crumbling gravestones, Clara Vance arrived with nothing but a trunk, a veil, and a house soaked in sorrow. No one knew where she came from. No one dared to ask. But 7 graves soon bloomed behind her manor, each dug with devotion, each marked by love turned to death. And now, the sea is stirring again. The first time Clara Vance stepped off the train at Ravenshollow station, the wind shifted. Not violently, but like a held breath exhaled after too long. Her boots touched the wooden platform with a grace too deliberate to be natural, as if she had rehearsed this moment in dreams. Dressed in morning black, with a veil that kissed her cheekbones, and gloved hands that held no luggage save a single leather trunk, she looked less like a traveler and more like an omen. The conductor tipped his hat without meeting her eyes. Even the station master, a man known for idle chatter, found himself suddenly mute. She passed them like mist. Bellmare Estate had stood abandoned for nearly 15 years, a mansion of iron and ivy that watched the ocean like a widow, watching the door that would never open again. Locals said it moaned at night. They said the gates locked themselves. They said the last woman who lived there leapt from the widow's walk, trailing white lace into the wind. Clara Vance bought it in silence, paid in full. No one saw her sign the deed. No one saw her move in. But on the first Sunday after her arrival, smoke curled from the chimney, and candlelight danced behind dusty panes. Children dared each other to touch the rusted gate. None did. By the second week, deliveries from town began to arrive. Tallow for candles, linen sheets, bay leaves, dried lavender, mercury glass, butcher's twine. The delivery boys returned pale and tight-lipped. One claimed to have seen the drawing-room walls covered in mirrors, each one shrouded in black cloth. Another whispered of a lullaby, hummed in a key not quite human. When questioned, Clara only smiled. She said little, but when she did, her voice was velvet, soft, low, soaked in something ancient. She did not attend the chapel. She walked the cliffs alone. She wore white after sundown. Her presence spread like fog, slow and unnoticed, until one day you realized the world was different. The men of Ravenshollow, old, young, married or not, began to speak her name too often. First in curiosity, then in admiration, then in something close to obsession. And when Henry Ashcombe, the handsome architect, with his laughing eyes and foolish heart, passed through town to assess repairs for the old manor, he took one look at Clara Vance and forgot everything else. Within days, he was seen at Bellmare. Within weeks, he was no longer seen at all. The wind off Widow's Cliff carried a sharpness that salted the skin, but Clara Vance stood unmoved at its edge, her white skirts brushing the stone like waves at low tide. Behind her, Henry Ashcombe paced nervously, holding a folded parchment and watching her as if she might vanish if he blinked too long. He had not meant to fall in love. He had arrived with blueprints and a promise to restore Bellmare's rotting bones, window frames like brittle ribs, staircases that groaned in protest. But then he saw her, her face, delicate and severe, as though carved from pale marble. Her eyes, so light they seemed almost blind, always looking at something just beyond him. She had invited him for tea that first evening, served in a cracked porcelain cup whose rim was lined with faded gold. The drawing room smelled faintly of salt and dried flowers. They had spoken of architecture, yes, but also of memory, of grief, of what it means to live among ruins. Henry found himself returning each day, offering excuses, loose shingles, splintering beams, though the house remained untouched. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Ravenshollow was not a place that tolerated mystery for long, but Clara's presence stilled gossip like ice over water. The old women crossed themselves when they passed Bellmare. The young men averted their eyes. Only Henry defied the current, returning again and again like a moth brushing its wings against a candle flame. On the third week, Clara allowed him into the west wing, a part of the house no one else had entered. There, Beneath dust-draped portraits and velvet curtains thick with mildew, Henry saw the room she called the solarium. Its glass ceiling was fractured like an old wound, and through it, the moon poured in like milk. In its center stood a harp with broken strings, and beside it, an empty chair that faced the sea. He used to sit there, she said softly, placing a hand on the chair's back. My first. Henry did not ask who she meant. He did not need to. Her sadness was like perfume, delicate, clinging, impossible to ignore. That night, he dreamt of veiled figures dancing across cliffs, and of bells tolling beneath the sea. The next morning, he returned with roses. By the week's end, he confessed his love. Clara had only smiled, a slow, mournful smile that made his knees tremble. She kissed his cheek and whispered, "Then, you must never leave me." 2 days later, Henry Ashcombe's body was found shattered on the rocks below Widow's Cliff, arms outstretched, eyes wide open, staring skyward. No note. No witnesses. The wind had been calm. At Bellmare, Clara stood before a newly dug grave, her veil fluttering like a moth's wing. She placed a single white rose upon the soil and whispered something no one could hear. Behind her, the bell tower rang once, and then the sea, as always, swallowed the sound. The townspeople said nothing aloud, but their eyes began to shift when Clara Vance passed through the market square. No one confronted her, not even when Henry Ashcombe's grave appeared behind the estate wall, beside the empty ones already waiting, each marked with a flat, uncarved stone. The boy who sold eggs no longer lingered at her gate. The butcher's apprentice would only leave parcels at the edge of the property, never stepping beyond the rusted threshold. Still, Clara moved among them with grace untouched, her white gloves clean, her veil drawn low, her manner as calm as moonlight. Widow's Cliff had always claimed its share of blood, fishermen pulled from its teeth, lovers dashed on its rocks, but Henry's fall felt different, too precise, too quiet. And Bellmare, that brooding house of silence, seemed more alert now, as if it had opened one eye and found itself pleased. One evening, Clara stood in the garden, pruning black-stemmed roses that bloomed despite the dying season. She hummed under her breath, a tune none recognized, but all remembered. Mabel Crow, half-blind and twice widowed, watched from her window across the lane, muttering to herself. "That song," she whispered, "I've heard it before." In the cradle, in the grave, inside Bellmare, a fire crackled behind iron grates, casting long shadows on wallpaper, the color of bruises. Clara knelt before a chest carved with roses and opened it with a small silver key. Within lay 7 velvet pouches, each tied with black ribbon. She reached for one and opened it slowly, revealing a man's ring, simple, gold, worn smooth from use. She turned it between her fingers, the way one might roll a thought too dangerous to speak. That night, the storm returned. It came not from the sea, but from within walls, creaked with voices, shutters snapped open, though the wind was still, and the fireplace flared without reason. Servants once hired to clean the house had long since quit, murmuring of cold spots and sobbing that echoed through halls with no source. Now, Clara lived alone, or nearly alone. Beneath the floorboards of the drawing room, hidden under a rug worn soft by footfalls, something pulsed faintly, like breath under skin. In the morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just her name in trembling ink, Clara Vance. Inside, the message was brief. "I know what you are." She did not smile. She did not frown. She folded the paper once, placed it in the fire, and watched it vanish to ash. Outside, the first frost painted Bellmare's garden white, but the roses still bled red. The stranger arrived on the second Sunday of November, riding a pale horse that looked too thin to bear the weight of travel. He wore a long wool coat and gloves stitched with initials that no longer matched his name. He introduced himself at the inn as Elias, though no one knew his surname and none dared ask. He paid in silver coins, dulled by age, and requested only 2 things: privacy and direction to Bellmare Estate. The innkeeper hesitated, but Elias only smiled, a sad, knowing smile that quieted protest. That afternoon, He walked the path alone, boots crunching over brittle leaves, until the manor rose before him like a shipwreck beached on stone. Clara Vance met him at the gate. She did not ask why he came. She only looked at him, long and slow, her eyes trailing the curve of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders like a man carrying something invisible but unbearably heavy. He bowed. She did not return it, but she did step aside. "The garden needs tending," she said, voice barely louder than the wind. "It's yours if you want it." And just like that, Elias became part of the house. He slept in the carriage house, worked from dawn to dusk, and spoke only when spoken to. Each morning, he brought Clara fresh herbs and wildflowers, strange bundles of roots, stalks, seeds. She accepted them in silence, sometimes placing them in jars on her mantle, other times crushing them between her fingers with a reverence that looked almost like mourning. He never asked what she did with them. She never asked why his left hand bore a scar that looked suspiciously like rope burn. The town grew restless. Mabel Crow, ever watchful, swore she had seen Elias walking barefoot through the graveyard by moonlight, touching each stone as if greeting old friends. Children whispered that he could not speak because the sea had taken his tongue. But it was not the sea that claimed Elias, it was the house. Slowly, he stopped going into town. His face grew pale, almost luminous in the dusk. He worked harder, even when there was no work to be done. And every evening, he left a single flower on the edge of Clara's windowsill. She never acknowledged them, but she never removed them either. When the snow came early that year, thick and sudden, it blanketed Bellmare in silence. One morning, the townsfolk awoke to find the pale horse still tethered to the post, but Elias was gone. The garden was strangely pristine, every petal intact, not a single footprint in the snow. Later that week, a new grave appeared. No name, just a flat stone and a single lily pressed into the frozen earth. Clara was seen walking along the cliffside that evening, her veil trailing like a banner. The bell at Bellmare tolled once. Then the frost devoured the sound. Lark Whitmore arrived under the pretense of writing a travel piece on coastal architecture, but she carried more notebooks than dresses and asked too many questions to be a tourist. She rented a room above the apothecary and spent her mornings sketching the crumbling houses of Ravenshollow, but her eyes were always drawn to Bellmare, rising from the fog like a wound that would not heal. She had read about Henry Ashcombe's fall in a Boston broadsheet. A small notice, almost forgotten, except for the phrase, "White-dressed widow watches from the cliff." That line had burrowed into her. She came with her curiosity wrapped in politeness, but the town sensed her intention like a storm behind glass. The baker's wife muttered that she asked too much. The fishmonger refused to meet her gaze. Only Mabel Crow offered anything more than silence, leaning across the church pew one gray morning to whisper, "That house eats men, child. Be careful who you try to feed it." Lark smiled and nodded and kept digging. At the library, she found little Bellmare's original deed, some yellowed newsprint, a single daguerreotype of the estate taken in the year of its construction, with a woman standing on the balcony whose face had blurred in the emulsion. But in the church records, tucked between birth ledgers and donation slips, Lark found a pattern. 7 names, 7 men, all from different towns, all with connections that dissolved after Clara Vance arrived. One had been a clockmaker, another a schoolteacher. 2 had been widowers, all were declared dead or missing. All were buried or rumored to be buried near wherever Clara had last been seen. And now, 2 graves at Bellmare, perhaps 3. Lark circled the estate one foggy morning, feigning a walk, and counted 6 stones from afar, half buried in frost. That night, she dreamt of candles floating in black water and a woman weeping without sound. The next day, she mailed her editor a letter. "If I don't write again in a week, burn every name I ever gave you. This story has teeth." At dusk, she stood at the edge of the Bellmare gate, hesitating. Something in the air felt thick, like breath held too long. She knocked. The door opened before she touched it. Clara Vance stood framed in candlelight, wearing a gown the color of milk left too long in the sun. Her eyes were calm, but her voice was iron. "You've been watching," she said. Lark did not deny it. "Then come in," Clara whispered. "Let's stop pretending." And so the hunter stepped into the lion's den, and the door closed behind her with the softness of a sigh. The drawing room at Bellmare was colder than the wind outside, though the fire danced high and the walls were hung in velvet. Lark stood just inside, her notebook heavy in her coat pocket, her heartbeat louder than the crackling logs. Clara motioned toward a high-backed chair without speaking. She wore no veil tonight. Her hair, black as morning lace, was pinned with silver combs that shimmered like frost, and her face pale, perfect, unreadable, belonged to a woman painted rather than born. "Tea?" she asked, and though Lark meant to decline, she heard herself whisper, "Yes." Clara poured from a white porcelain teapot into cups as delicate as bone. Steam curled between them like breath. Lark watched the woman move, each gesture smooth, as if rehearsed 1,000 times. There was no tremble, no hesitation. Only silence pressed between sips, the kind of silence that knew what it was keeping. "You are not here for architecture," Clara said, finally. Her voice was soft, but without warmth. "Nor for history." "No," Lark replied. "I'm here for the dead." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock, its face half-shadowed by ivy through the window. Clara tilted her head. "They always come eventually, with questions, with ink and suspicion. But questions are dangerous things, Miss Whitmore. They have sharp edges." Lark leaned forward. "And answers?" Clara smiled, just enough to show the echo of teeth. "Sharper still." She stood and crossed the room, her hand brushing along a shelf of old volumes, each bound in cracked leather. From one, she withdrew a single page, yellowed, folded once. She held it out, but did not move closer. "You want a story," she said. "Take this." Lark reached for it, but Clara's fingers did not release the paper. Their eyes met. "Read it when you're alone," she said, "and not before the moon rises." Lark nodded. Breath caught in her throat, and the paper passed into her hands. That night, back in her room above the apothecary, Lark waited until the town bells marked the hour, midnight. She lit a single candle and unfolded the paper. It was a death notice, no name, just a date 20 years past, and a single sentence scrawled beneath it: "Buried in love, dug up in wrath." As she stared at the words, the flame flickered, though no wind stirred. Below her window, on the empty street, someone began to hum. A low, slow melody, a lullaby. The same one she'd heard before, the one no one else remembered. She closed the window, she locked the door, and still she could hear it. The song of a woman in white, and the graves she filled like pages in a forgotten book. Morning brought no comfort. The sky over Ravenshollow hung low and bruised, and the sea frothed against the rocks like something rabid. Lark kept the paper folded in her pocket as she walked through town, hoping movement might dull the unease clinging to her spine. But every step led her closer to questions she no longer wanted answered. At the church, she found Mabel Crow lighting a candle beneath the altar's weeping Madonna. The old woman didn't turn when Lark entered, but her voice, thin and dry, carried through the cold air. "You saw it, didn't you? The paper." Lark hesitated, then nodded. "What does it mean?" Mabel blew out the match with a shaky breath. "It means you're already too deep, child. That woman doesn't give unless she's ready to take." Outside, the wind howled through the graveyard like something mourning. Lark's eyes drifted to the hill beyond, where Bellmare loomed like a memory refusing to fade. That afternoon, she returned to the estate, this time not to ask, but to search. Clara wasn't in the garden. The windows were dark, the bell silent. Lark circled the manor's perimeter, boots sinking in wet leaves, until she found the cellar doors partially open, ivy coiled around the handles like fingers. She hesitated only a moment before descending the steps. The air below was damp and metallic, thick with the scent of old stone and something far more human. Lark lit her lantern and followed the narrow corridor to a wooden door warped with age. Behind it, she found shelves lined with bottles, each labeled in careful script: foxglove, belladonna, nightshade, and at the center of the room, beneath a circle of dried herbs and white chalk symbols, stood a large chest carved with roses, just like the one she had seen in her dream. She knelt before it, hands trembling, and opened the lid. Inside were 7 velvet pouches. 6 had already been untied. Each held a man's ring, nestled in black silk. Lark picked one up heavy, gold, engraved on the inside with the initials H. A. Henry Ashcombe. She reached for the 7th pouch, still knotted. But as her fingers touched the ribbon, the cellar door slammed shut. The lantern flickered, then died, and in the dark, Lark heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps above her, slow, measured, familiar. Clara Vance, descending the stairs not in haste, but with the calm of someone returning to a room she had always meant to find occupied. "You shouldn't be here," came her voice, floating like smoke. Lark backed away from the chest, breath caught in her throat. "Neither should they," she whispered. Clara appeared in the threshold, framed in shadow, her white gown pale as bone. "And yet," she said, stepping closer, "here we all are." Clara did not shout, did not scold. She simply reached out and shut the chest with a soft finality that made Lark flinch harder than any slam. The rings were gone again, swallowed into velvet and memory. "Curiosity," Clara murmured, "is the sweetest sin, and the costliest." Her gown rustled faintly as she moved to the cellar wall and lit a candelabra with a single match drawn from the folds of her sleeve. The flame cast trembling shadows across her face, softening nothing. "I had hoped," she continued, "that you might remain untouched, an observer, a quiet leaf on the water, but you've stepped into the current now." Lark swallowed, throat dry as dust. "Who were they?" Clara tilted her head, eyes shining like glass over ice. "You already know. You've traced the lines. Names, towns, graves. You came here with your strings and your pins, expecting a story. Well, here it is." She circled the room slowly, fingertips trailing along the bottles of poison like they were prayer beads. "Each of them came to me in different ways. A letter, a glance, a wound I could not see but could feel in my bones. They were not innocent, Miss Whitmore. Not one. They were liars, betrayers, thieves of breath and promise." Her voice, still calm, grew darker, as if dragging something from the bottom of a well. "And I loved them. That is the cruelty of it. I loved them all." Lark backed against the stone wall, every instinct screaming to flee, but her legs held still, rooted by something more potent than fear understanding. Clara knelt beside the chest, pressing her hand to its lid as though soothing a restless child. "I was born into a lineage of silence. The Vance women kept their secrets like heirlooms. But there is a legacy written in blood as well as ink, and mine came with instructions." She looked up, eyes catching Lark's. "7 must be mourned. 7 must return to the earth. Only then may I sleep." Lark's voice, when it came, was thin and shaking. "Return to the earth for what?" Clara smiled, and it was not cruel, but it was ancient. Redemption, or rest, or something nameless between the two. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "Come now," she said, as though nothing had happened. "You'll catch cold down here." Lark followed her, heart thudding against ribs like fists on a coffin lid, but as she passed the chest, she couldn't stop herself from glancing back. The 7th pouch was no longer tied. It lay open, empty, waiting. And when she reached the top of the stairs, the bell at Bellmare tolled once, only once, but the sound sank into her skin like a nail. The sky wept without thunder, the rain fine as lace and cold as regret. Lark stood at her window, staring down at the inn's empty street where the fog dragged its fingers along the cobblestones. Sleep had not come. It hadn't dared, not after the cellar, not after the 7th pouch. She pressed her hand to the glass, trying to steady her breath. Beneath her skin, something felt misplaced, as though her heart had shifted slightly left. She reached into her coat and drew out the ring, no longer in the chest, but somehow now in her pocket, heavy and silent, warm as if just removed from a hand. There were no initials, only a mark etched so faintly it was almost imagined, a circle pierced by a single downward thorn. She knew it, had seen it scratched into the stone above Elias's grave, had found it scribbled in the margins of the church death records. It was a signature, not Clara's, something older. She pocketed the ring and left the inn without breakfast, walking quickly past the chapel, past Mabel's shuttered windows, past the grocer, who now turned his face whenever she passed. She followed the curve of the road to the edge of the village, where the grass grew wild and the land sloped toward the cliffs. There, hidden beneath a thicket of briar and salt-thick air, was the old graveyard, the forgotten one. No family plots, no clean markers, just crooked stones and sunken earth. She had seen it on a map from the library's archives, marked Cholera Dead, 1814, but some stones were newer. She found them by feel, the engravings shallow and strange, like letters misshaped by someone who did not quite know the language. One read, Beloved, another read, Ode. The third had no name, only the same sigil carved into the cellar ring. Lark knelt, fingers trailing the moss-slicked stone. She did not see the figure watching her from the trees. Clara said nothing as she stepped forward, her gown unbothered by the wet grass, her hands folded before her like a mourner at the end of a funeral. They asked to be buried here, she said softly. Far from town, far from wives who would never claim them, far from families who whispered of shame. Lark rose slowly, the ring still in her palm. And you honored that? Clara's expression didn't shift. No, I obeyed it. There's a difference. The rain fell harder now, soaking them both, and neither moved. You're afraid, Clara said, almost kindly, but fear is only the body remembering what it survived. You've survived worse, haven't you? Lark tried to speak, but found no words. The ring in her hand felt heavier now, colder. Clara reached out and gently closed Lark's fingers around it. You're not the seventh, she whispered. You're the witness. And then she walked back into the fog, vanishing before the bell could toll again. The sea was louder that night, crashing against the cliffs, with a voice like a choir of mourning women. Lark sat hunched over the desk in her rented room, pages spread before her like a crime scene, candle wax pooling beside half-scribbled notes and sketches of symbols she now saw in her dreams. The ring lay beside her inkpot, glinting whenever the flame danced too close, as if it too were waiting to be written. Clara had vanished into the fog hours ago, and no light had returned to Bellmare since. Lark had watched from the window, half hoping to see her reappear, half praying she would not. The word witness clung to her like a stain, and she didn't yet know if it was a title or a warning. At midnight, she opened the diary she'd kept since arriving in Ravenshollow. Not the notebook for her article, the other one, the one filled with things she could never publish. Inside were fragments, dreams, names, the drawn faces of men she'd never met, but somehow recognized. There was Henry Ashcombe, with his soft eyes and wind-tossed hair. Elias, silent and gentle, always near the roses. Dr. Ambrose Quill, whose obituary she'd clipped years ago and now stared back at her from a yellowed corner of the page. The more she traced the names, the more she realized the pattern Clara had never spoken aloud. Each man had something in common, beyond charm, or status, or sorrow. They had all been connected to a single network, quietly, deeply, invisibly. Investors in the same obscure shipping company, donors to a vanished religious order, names scribbled in the margins of ledger books found in towns where Clara had stayed before Bellmare. And every one of them had been involved, somehow, in the disappearance of a woman. Not Clara, someone else, someone who had come before her, the original bride. Lark whispered the name she had found at the bottom of a baptism record burned around the edges. Seraphine Vance. There was no birth date, only the word condemned, written in red ink. Clara had said she was obeying something. What if that something was blood? Legacy, not as inheritance, but as curse. Lark stood and paced, the creak of the floorboards like breath in her ears. She thought of the velvet pouches, the rings, the unmarked graves. She thought of the line Clara had given her once, in passing, like a riddle. Love is a blade sharpened on the soul. Then came a knock once, then again. Slow, heavy, not urgent, just inevitable. Lark froze, every candle in the room extinguishing without wind. The ring rolled to the edge of the desk and stopped. She turned toward the door. No voice called from the hall, but she already knew who it would be. Clara had not come for comfort. She had come for confession. Clara stood in the threshold, soaked through with rain, her hair undone, clinging to her cheeks like ink on parchment. She said nothing at first, only held Lark's gaze with the look of someone who had already spoken all the words that mattered, and now returned only to listen. Lark stepped aside, her body moving before her thoughts could argue, and the door closed behind Clara with a click that felt more final than it should. She did not sit. She moved slowly around the room, touching nothing, her eyes sweeping over Lark's notes, the maps, the open journal, the sketches. She paused only when she saw the name Seraphine. Her breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. She was the first, Clara whispered, the first to be silenced, the first to vanish. She turned, her expression softer now, as though the name had unlocked something tender beneath her ice. My great-grandmother, accused of unholy acts. They said she bewitched men, drained them of spirit, tempted them into madness. But it wasn't madness, it was guilt. They took her in secret, no trial, no funeral, just a field and a fire and a vow never to speak her name again. She approached the window, looking out toward Bellmare, where its silhouette loomed in the fog, blurred like memory. But the land remembers, the sea remembers, the blood remembers. Her voice grew quieter. And so I was born, not just with her name in my bones, but her silence too. The curse is not in what I do, it's in what they did. I only finish what they began. Lark said nothing. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the candlelight casting shadows shaped like ghosts. Each man was part of it, Clara continued. Their fathers, their uncles, their legacies built on Seraphine's ash. They thought they'd buried her, but they planted her. She looked down at her hands, fingers pale, trembling slightly, and I bloomed. For a moment, the room was completely still. Outside, the rain turned to mist. Lark stood, unsure of what words could possibly live in such a silence. Clara moved toward her, slow and deliberate. You weren't chosen, Lark. You arrived, of your own will, with your own questions. That makes you different. That makes you. She reached out, fingers brushing Lark's temple like a blessing or a brand, the one who decides how it ends. Lark stared into her eyes and saw not madness, not guilt, but purpose, a cold, ancient flame that had never truly gone out. There are 2 graves left, Clara said softly. Only 2, but the last must be given, not taken. And that choice was never mine. She turned to leave, trailing water and sorrow. At the door, she looked back once. Seraphine was not a monster, she said. She was a mirror, and every man who looked into her saw the thing he feared most. Then she was gone, and the ring on the desk cracked down the center, clean and silent, like a heart splitting in half. The days that followed unraveled like wet thread, slow and disintegrating. Lark wandered through Ravenshollow in a daze, her notebook untouched, her pen quiet. The townspeople watched her differently now, less with suspicion, more with pity, as though they sensed she had crossed into some place they dared not name. Bellmare loomed behind her thoughts, like a shadow cast on the inside of her skull. She hadn't returned, not yet, but every path she walked felt as though it curved back toward its gates. Even in sleep, she dreamt of its halls. The walls breathing, the windows blinking, the doors whispering names she didn't recognize, but somehow knew. One morning, a letter appeared beneath her door. No seal, no signature, just a single sentence in that same slanted, delicate hand. The 6th has arrived. Lark dropped the page as if it burned. She ran through the rain, mud clinging to her boots, wind slashing at her coat. She passed the chapel, where even Mabel's candles seemed dimmer than usual, and made her way toward Bellmare, with a pace that felt less like running and more like falling. The gates were open, not wide, just enough to let her in. The garden had changed. The roses bloomed darker now, almost black, their scent thick and suffocating. The air felt heavier, as though the ground itself were exhaling sorrow. Lark stepped through the front door without knocking, the house greeting her, not with sound, but stillness, deep, watchful, coiled. Clara was waiting in the drawing room, her dress a muted gray this time, like a storm that had already passed. She stood beside a coffin, small, polished, closed, no nameplate, no flowers, just a single folded cloth draped over the lid. It was a man's handkerchief. Embroidered in one corner, the initials LG. Lark felt her stomach twist. Lucian Gray, she breathed. The poet. Clara nodded once. He came 3 days ago, with verses and vodka, and a heart already breaking. He told me he wrote about ghosts, but had never seen one until he saw me. Her eyes flicked toward the coffin, then back to Lark. He said I was the most beautiful eulogy he'd ever known. Did you love him? Lark asked, voice cracking. Clara didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside, revealing the sixth grave already dug in the garden, the dirt beside it still damp, still red. One remains, she said, and then it ends. One more heart for the silence. One more name to vanish. Lark looked out the window toward the sea, where storm clouds gathered like mourners. Her fingers closed around the broken ring in her pocket. And the seventh? Clara turned to her, eyes colder now. The seventh chooses. Then she walked away, leaving Lark alone with the coffin, the garden, and the house that was beginning to hum again, low and hungry. The storm arrived that night, not with thunder, but with a moan that rolled across the sea, like something wounded. Bellmare's windows shook in their frames, and the chimney howled like it remembered every name whispered within its walls. Lark remained in the drawing room long after Clara had vanished down the corridor, sitting beside the sixth coffin, with the strange stillness of someone caught between watching and being watched. The fire had burned down to coals, but she didn't move to stir it. Instead, she stared into the glass of the parlor cabinet, not at her own reflection, but at what flickered just behind it, the warped image of the garden, where 6 headstones gleamed slick with rain. She could feel the house listening, as if its walls had ears and memory, as if every word spoken since Seraphine's time still floated in the air, clinging to the drapes and the floorboards and the seams of Clara's dresses. Lark pressed her fingers to the ring in her coat pocket, feeling the sharp line of its crack against her palm. What Clara had said that the seventh must choose repeated itself over and over in her skull, like an echo chasing its own tail. She didn't know what choice was left. She wasn't a killer, but she wasn't innocent either. She had come looking for death, chasing its scent through yellowed clippings and rumors, and now it was perched at her shoulder, waiting to see if she'd reach for the knife or the quill. Somewhere above her, floorboards creaked slow, deliberate. Clara was moving, or someone else was. Lark stood, legs numb, and followed the sound. She climbed the grand staircase with the caution of a trespasser, though the house now belonged to her as much as it did to anyone living. At the end of the hall, one door stood open. Inside, candlelight flickered over, peeling wallpaper, and a bed draped in white gauze. Clara sat beside it, unmoving, her hands folded in her lap. On the bed lay a woman frail, unconscious, her skin so pale it nearly matched the sheets. Lark stepped inside. Who is she? Clara did not look up. Her name was Ruth, the governor's widow. She came seeking healing, found me instead. Her voice was flat. She's not dead, Lark whispered. Not yet. She asked for peace, Clara replied, but peace has its price. The wind slammed against the house, and the candle guttered. This is the seventh? Lark asked. No, Clara said quietly, eyes rising to meet hers. You are. The house groaned then, as if pleased, as if the decision had finally arrived. Lark did not step back. She moved toward the woman in the bed, not with pity, but with something deeper, something hollowed out and waiting to be filled. Outside, the bell rang once, then again, twice now, one for the dead, one for the chosen. The seventh grave had begun to open. The earth behind Bellmare was softer than it should have been, as if the land itself had surrendered to the ritual. Rain had loosened the soil, and by dawn, the seventh grave yawned wide beneath a gray sky that hung low enough to touch. Lark stood at its edge, her boots sinking into the mud, the hem of her coat heavy with dew and indecision. Clara was beside her, calm as always, her hands folded behind her back, watching not the grave, but Lark, as though the shape of her silhouette would reveal the answer. "It isn't about murder," Clara said. "It never was. It's about release. 7 hearts, 7 vows broken, 7 debts inherited. The grave is not punishment, it is payment." Lark stared into the hole, deep and dark and final. "But payment for what?" she whispered. "For silence." Clara answered, her voice thin as the mist curling around them. "For the centuries of looking away, for the women buried without names, for the promises that turned to poison." She turned to face her. "The men who lie here were not victims. They were authors. Each wrote a line in the curse that binds us. I simply closed their stories." The garden was still. Not even the sea dared make a sound. Lark reached into her coat and took out the broken ring, holding it up between them like a relic. "And me?" she asked. "What do I close?" Clara stepped forward, her fingers ghosting over Lark's wrist, guiding the ring back to her palm. "That is your choice," she said softly. "To end this, you must either lie with them or leave knowing. You let the final wound stay open." "You want me to kill?" "No," Clara said. "I want you to understand. The seventh grave doesn't ask for a death. It asks for a reckoning." Behind them, the wind stirred, and the bell at Bellmare groaned low and long, as though resisting its own toll. Lark looked to the house, its windows staring back like eyes long blind, and she thought of Seraphine, of the nameless women tucked between church walls and forgotten fields, of rings dropped into velvet like coins at a toll gate. She thought of Ruth in the bed, breathing shallowly, caught between choice and consequence. "If I walk away," Lark asked, "will it all continue?" Clara's silence was answer enough. Lark looked once more into the grave and imagined her own name etched into a headstone, not out of surrender, but solidarity. She saw her hands planting the ring like a seed, saw silence curling up through the soil like vines, and then she turned away, not toward Clara, not toward Bellmare, toward the fog. The grave did not protest, neither did Clara. Some endings require no witness, and some stories, once buried, should never be unearthed again. Ravenshollow felt altered when Lark returned, less a place and more a shadow of one, as though the fog had finally seeped into the bones of the town and made it forget its own shape. The people looked at her without looking, their eyes skimming her face as if they feared what they might find behind it. Mabel Crow didn't speak to her when they passed in the chapel yard. The apothecary handed over her usual tonic without charge, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on the counter. Lark said nothing. She had learned now what silence could do. She spent her days walking the edges of town, where the land began to crumble into sea, and the stones bore names weathered to whispers. Her notebook remained closed, her pen untouched. She no longer searched for answers, but listened instead, letting the wind and the gulls and the long breath of the tide speak truths in their own language. Bellmare, she noticed, no longer smoked from its chimney. No lights flickered through its windows. At night, it stood in silhouette against the stars like the husk of something once alive, but the bell still hung above it, still waiting. Sometimes she thought she could hear it sighing. Clara had not been seen since the morning Lark left the seventh grave open. Some said she'd taken a ferry south, though no one had seen her board. Others said she had returned to the sea, like something half-born from it, but Lark knew better. Clara had simply vanished, the way certain truths do not with a cry, but with a closing door. The grave remained, untouched, unfilled. Sometimes Lark returned to it, standing just at its edge, imagining what it meant to walk into a space carved for a soul that hadn't yet decided who it belonged to. She would hold the cracked ring in her palm and press it to the soil, then draw it back before it sank in. The land always waited. It never hurried her. On the seventh day after her return, just as the sun slid into the ocean, like a promise broken too late, the bell at Bellmare rang once. Only once. But its echo wrapped around the town like a vow. Lark stood in the chapel courtyard, eyes lifted to the sky. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She only whispered one name, Seraphine, and closed her eyes. That night, she dreamt of a garden blooming with black roses, of a house with all its windows open, and of 7 women walking into the sea with their heads held high. In the morning, the grave behind Bellmare was gone. Not filled, not disturbed. Gone, as though it had never existed at all. Only the wind remained, and the ring, and the silence that now knew her name. The innkeeper found the journal first, tucked neatly beneath the pillow in Lark's empty bed, its leather cover still damp from the salt air. He opened it with reluctant fingers, hoping for an address, a name to send it to, but inside were pages of strange entries, dreams written like memories, sketches of graves that no longer existed, symbols traced in red ink that looked too much like blood to be comfortable. He closed it and said nothing. By noon, word had spread. Lark Whitmore had vanished, her room untouched, her coat still on the hook, her boots wet by the door. No note, no sign of struggle, just the lingering scent of lavender and rain. The villagers whispered, of course. Some said she'd walked into the sea. Others claimed she had gone north, following whispers of another haunted house, another line of names buried beneath marble and moss. But the truth settled heavier than speculation. Ravenshollow knew now what it meant to lose someone without truly losing them, how a shadow could stretch long after its owner had gone. Bellmare remained empty, doors locked, windows shuttered, garden overgrown with wild roses that bloomed out of season. Yet some nights, if one walked the cliffside path at dusk, they might glimpse a candle flickering behind the topmost window, or hear the low strain of a harp with no strings echoing through the fog. And in the graveyard, where no 7th stone had ever been carved, children swore they saw footprints bare, delicate, walking away from the earth, not into it. Mabel Crow, whose eyes had seen more than they should have, stood each week at the chapel's altar and lit a candle, not for the dead, but for the missing. When asked, she would only say, "Some names don't need graves. They leave their mark elsewhere." The library kept Lark's file open, a small folder labeled Vance Inquiry, unresolved. Inside it, a single slip of paper had been added, written in the innkeeper's hand. Grave, 7, vanished. Bell, told once. No witnesses. Months passed, then a year. The town began to forget again, the way it always had, burying the strange with routine, folding the haunted back into the hymn. But the sea never forgets, and neither does Bellmare. One night, just as winter returned, a girl arrived by train, a quiet thing in a wool coat with a satchel full of papers, and a photograph of a house no one had spoken of in years. She asked the station master if he knew where to find Bellmare Estate. He hesitated. His hands trembled, but still, he pointed. The girl thanked him and walked into the fog, her footsteps steady, her eyes wide, and her coat lined with thorns. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, the bell rang once, then silence, then the sea, shifting gently, as if preparing to open once more. She called herself Eleanor, though whether it was her birth name or one she had borrowed from the pages of a forgotten book, no one asked. She spoke with the hush of someone used to listening, more than telling, her words precise and deliberate, like a writer rereading every sentence before letting it go. The townsfolk watched her the way they had once watched Clara, with suspicion wrapped in politeness, with glances held too long and greetings that felt like warnings. But Eleanor didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she did, and simply didn't care. She walked Ravenshallow's narrow streets as if retracing the steps of someone else's story, pausing too long at corners, staring too long at doors. Her questions were gentle, soft things with pointed edges. Did the chapel still keep records from the old estate? Had any strangers passed through before her? Had anyone seen a woman in white near the cliffs? The answers came cautiously, dripped like water through cracked stone. Most had forgotten the names, or claimed to. Bellmare? Oh, that house had been empty for years. No one had lived there since the widow disappeared, or died, or turned into salt. Depends who you asked. But Eleanor pressed on. She studied the graveyard, where no seventh stone stood, ran her fingers along the wrought iron gate that framed Bellmare's twisted path, and when no one followed her, she went through it. The garden had changed again. The roses now grew in spirals, like coiled sentences, their petals dark with memory. The front door opened before she could knock. Not wide, just enough. Inside, dust slept undisturbed on the furniture, but the air was not empty. It hummed faintly, like a chorus holding its breath. Eleanor crossed the threshold and paused in the foyer, where the walls bore no portraits, but still seemed to watch her. She placed her satchel on the table and withdrew a single item, a photograph, cracked at the edges. Lark Whitmore caught mid-laugh beside a train platform, wind in her hair. A note on the back in pencil. If I vanish, find Bellmare. Eleanor wandered the house with careful steps, as though unwilling to wake it fully. She found the solarium with its shattered ceiling, the cellar door sealed tight, the harp in the corner missing its strings. She sat before it and placed her hands on the frame, and for a moment the house exhaled, just once. Not a moan, not a creak, but the sound of something being remembered. That night, the bell rang not once but 3 times. The town heard it and shivered. Eleanor remained at Bellmare, lights burning behind its windows once more. She made no grave, carved no stone. But in the garden, something new bloomed, white lilies in the shape of open eyes. The sea, watching from beyond the cliffs, whispered approval, and the house, for the first time in years, dreamed. By the second week, Eleanor had begun speaking to the house, not in madness, but in rhythm phrases, murmured under her breath as she walked the halls, fragments of old poems, questions without answers, and the occasional apology, quiet as prayer. Bellmare did not speak back, not with words, but with presence. Doors that opened before her hand reached them, floorboards that creaked in a language only she seemed to understand, mirrors that never quite held her reflection still. She slept in the west wing, the one Clara had kept closed, and awoke each morning with her hair damp and the scent of lilies in the folds of her sheets. Ravenshollow watched from a distance. The innkeeper refused to deliver parcels past the rusted gate. The postmistress began stamping letters to Bellmare, returned to sender, without opening them. The apothecary, when asked about Eleanor, only shook his head and said, "She's not the first." Still, Eleanor stayed. Each day she ventured deeper into the estate, and each night she returned to her satchel and scribbled notes with urgency, as if documenting a language no one else could see. The journal grew thick with sketches of symbols, rings, roots, circles stitched with thorns, and names scratched out, rewritten, then scratched again. Her writing grew stranger, tighter, more frantic, until even she could barely read it. Then, on the 7th night, the bell rang again. Once, then silence. Eleanor, barefoot and breathless, ran to the cellar door, now cracked open, as if exhaling after years of holding something in. She descended the stairs with a candle clenched in her fist, its flame trembling like a secret. The chest was still there, the velvet pouches tucked inside, like memory laid out in neat rows. But now there were 8, one more than before. She opened the newest, half expecting her own name etched inside the ring, but there were no initials, only a single drop of red, still wet, as if the metal had just been forged from blood. Her hands trembled. She turned slowly, sensing movement behind her, and there, standing in the shadows where no candlelight reached, was Clara, not changed, not aged, not dead, simply returned. Her eyes were darker now, deeper, but her voice was the same velvet over steel. "You came for her," Clara said, "but you found yourself." Eleanor couldn't breathe. "Where is she?" she asked, but the words felt distant, underwater. Clara stepped forward and touched Eleanor's cheek, just once, just gently. "She's watching," she whispered, "just like the rest." And then she vanished into the dark, not with a scream or a rush of wind, but like a thought erased before it could be spoken. Eleanor stood alone, the candle burning lower, the pouches breathing behind her like sleeping mouths. Somewhere above, the sea began to rise. And Bellmare, once silent, began to hum again, as if remembering a song it had only ever sung to women who knew the weight of rings and the shape of graves. The next morning, the tide swallowed the cliffs whole, dragging with it the fog, the silence, and any illusion that Bellmare had ever been just a house. Eleanor woke to the windows, trembling, their panes streaked with salt, as though the sea had reached up to touch them in the night. Her candle had burned to wax on the cellar floor, and the eighth ring now sat beside her bed, gleaming faintly in the grey light. She didn't remember carrying it up. She barely remembered sleeping. The journal lay open where she had left it, its pages now stiff with damp, the ink warped into patterns that resembled vines. Or veins. Or veins pretending to be vines. She traced one with her finger, not to read, but to feel, and when she closed the book, the house groaned soft, almost apologetic, like a beast aching in its ribs. Eleanor dressed slowly, lacing her boots with fingers that moved like they'd aged a decade overnight. She crossed the threshold of her room without looking back and made her way through the winding halls of Bellmare, each room blinking to life as she passed. The solarium, once shattered, now held glass again. Not clean, not new, but enough to catch the morning light and twist it into strange colors that danced across the walls like bruises. The harp stood in its place, restrung with something too fine to be wire, and when Eleanor brushed her fingers across it, it sang not a melody, but a sound like breath caught in a throat. The garden waited, dew clinging to every petal, the air thick with the scent of rose and rain. In the center, where no path had ever led before, a bench had appeared. Upon it sat a book bound in pale leather, no title, no lock. She opened it slowly. It was empty, every page blank, waiting. Behind her, the wind changed. The bell did not ring, but Eleanor heard it anyway, tolling deep inside her bones, low and slow, like a heart remembering how to beat. She picked up her pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote the first line. She came to the house when the house was ready to be seen. As the words bled into the page, the garden stilled, the sea held its breath, and the house, ancient, haunted, hungry, leaned closer. For the first time, it was not Clara's story, or Seraphine's, or even Lark's. It was Eleanor's, a new voice rising from the soil, not to bury, but to name, not to silence, but to sing. And in the distance, past stone and mist and memory, the sea, too, began to speak, not in waves, but in whispers, not in storms, but in stories. Bellmare listened, and for once the house smiled. The stories began to change the town before the townsfolk noticed they were being told. Eleanor's book remained unread by any eyes but hers, yet something in Ravenshollow shifted as if the ink had soaked through the soil itself. Windows stayed open longer, doors creaked in conversation, children played near the cliffs again, whispering to imaginary friends with names that tasted old. Mabel Crow, for the first time in decades, lit 2 candles at the altar, one for the missing and one for those who chose to be. The 7th grave, once vanished, had returned not as a wound in the earth, but as a marble bench tucked near the chapel gate. No inscription, just a single carved rose, opened in full bloom, its petals curled like fingers around a hidden name. Eleanor passed it every morning on her way to the cliffs, always pausing, always touching the stone with the back of her hand. Bellmare had grown quieter, not out of silence, but peace, like a song reaching its final note and choosing to linger. The rooms no longer shifted. The mirrors held still. The velvet pouches remained in the cellar, untouched, but no longer breathing. Clara had not returned, nor had Lark. But Eleanor often dreamed of them sometimes in the garden, speaking in a language of petals and wind, sometimes by the sea, their hands joined, their faces lit with something beyond sorrow. In those dreams, they never spoke. They only watched her write, nodding slowly, as though each word pulled the roots of the curse farther from the bone. One afternoon, the sea delivered a visitor, a man, soaked and shivering, washed ashore beneath the cliffs with no memory of how he had arrived. His name was Matthew, his eyes were blue, and when Eleanor found him and pulled him upright, he said her name like he'd always known it. The townsfolk watched carefully, murmured their concerns behind closed shutters, but Eleanor did not flinch. She brought him to Bellmare, fed him warm broth, and let him rest in the east wing, the one with the windows that faced the sea. Days passed. Then, a week, Matthew remained. He asked questions, but never the wrong ones. He touched the house gently, as if afraid to wake it, and when he laughed, Bellmare didn't groan or shudder, it listened. One night, Eleanor handed him the book, the one she had filled. He read it in silence, front to back, his fingers trembling only once at the page, with the eighth ring drawn in ink and blood. When he finished, he looked at her, not with fear, but understanding. "You ended it," he said. "No," she replied, voice soft as mist. "I named it, so it could finally rest." Outside, the wind stirred. Bellmare exhaled, and the roses, dark, thorned, eternal, began to bloom again, this time without blood. Spring came early to Ravenshollow that year, the frost retreating like a secret forgiven too soon. The sea softened, the gulls circled higher, and Bellmare, once a shrine to sorrow, stood in the morning light with its windows open and its doors unlatched, as though it had forgotten how to be haunted. Eleanor walked the garden barefoot now, letting the soil cling to her skin, unafraid of what might rise beneath it. The graves had grown over lush with moss and blooms, and though she could still trace their shapes with her eyes closed, they no longer called to her. They simply existed, part of the land, no longer hungry. Matthew stayed. He tended the roses, mended the gate, replaced the broken tiles in the solarium, without needing to ask where they belonged. When he held her gaze, it was not with wonder or wariness, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who had lived long enough to know that some stories are not meant to be solved, only witnessed. Together, they rebuilt the house in gestures, not declarations. A book added to the library, curtains changed, tea steeped on rainy mornings with no reason but comfort, and every few weeks Eleanor would write never from memory, but from feeling, her fingers guided not by plot, but by pulse. The townsfolk began to return, cautiously at first, bringing jars of jam, loaves of bread, shy invitations to markets and suppers. They no longer asked about the past. They no longer whispered about the bell. Bellmare had become something else, no longer a house of ghosts, but a house of echoes, softened and lived in, a place where silence was not ominous but earned. Still, on the eve of the equinox, Eleanor stood once more before the cellar door. It remained closed. She held the key but did not use it. Behind it were velvet pouches and names etched in time, but also the truth of her arrival, the weight she had carried, the line she had crossed, the inheritance she had chosen. Matthew joined her without speaking. He placed his hand over hers, and together they set the key down, not in the lock, but on the floor. They turned away. The house did not protest. That night, as they sat in the solarium, watching the last of the sun bleed gold across the waves, a breeze carried through the broken harp strings and made a single sound, a low, trembling hum, neither mournful nor joyous, just whole. Eleanor leaned her head against Matthew's shoulder. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. He took a breath. "I think the curse is. But the story? No. That will keep growing. In the garden. In the wind. In you." She nodded, and somewhere deep in the bones of Bellmare, something settled, like a book closed gently after the final page is read. Not forgotten, just finished. For now. The letter arrived without warning, tucked between a parcel of herbs and a bill for the chapel roof repairs, addressed not to Eleanor, but to the keeper of Bellmare. No return address. The handwriting was narrow, slanted, old-fashioned familiar. Eleanor opened it with a strange calm, unfolding the single sheet of parchment as the morning sun filtered through the solarium glass. "There is another house," it read, "not by the sea, but by the woods. It watches like Bellmare once did. The roots are restless. The garden has names. It waits for someone to listen. No signature, no map." But Eleanor didn't need one. She read it twice, then set the paper down beside her journal and poured herself a cup of tea. Matthew watched from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel, the question already in his eyes. "Will you go?" he asked. Eleanor looked out toward the cliffs, where the sea stretched endless and soft, then back to the hearth where the fire murmured in its brick throat. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." That afternoon, she walked the garden alone, fingertips trailing the vines, each bloom like a pulse against her skin. The seventh grave, now only a patch of lilies, pulsed faintly beneath her boots. She knelt, pressed her palm to the earth, and whispered a thank you, not to Clara, not to Lark, to the silence itself, to the part of her that had once been lost enough to find this place. Inside, she tucked the letter between pages of her journal, careful not to smudge the ink. She packed no bags. She made no announcements. Bellmare would know when it was time. That evening, she and Matthew danced in the solarium, barefoot on the mosaic floor, the harp's broken strings catching wind like a distant memory humming along. They didn't speak of farewells, only of beginnings, as though one could never truly leave what they had named. When the moon rose, high and clean and full, Eleanor stood beneath it and made a quiet vow. No more graves, only gardens. The next morning, she was gone. Not vanished, departed. A path had appeared beyond the chapel, one that hadn't been there the day before, lined with thornless bramble and white blooms that blinked in the light, like eyes waking from a long sleep. Matthew found her journal open on the table, a new page written in a steadier hand. "This house has rested, another stirs. I go not to bury, but to witness, to name, to write the silence into song." Bellmare stood quietly behind him, unchanged and eternal. And far beyond the town, beyond fields and fog, in the hush between forest branches, another house opened its eyes, waiting, listening, ready. Somewhere deep in the woods, where the sun trickled through the trees like spilled gold, and the air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten names. A new house stood. It wasn't grand like Bellmare, nor broken. It was small, sharp at the edges, crouched low as if listening. Ivy clung to its bones. The windows were clouded, not with dust, but with breath. Someone, something was already inside, waiting. Eleanor arrived at twilight, the path behind her, folding in on itself like pages closing. She wore her coat and boots, though the forest was warm, and carried only her journal and the eighth ring, now strung around her neck on a chain of red thread. She did not knock. The door creaked open at her touch. Inside, the walls pulsed with quiet, alive, but not yet awake. Shadows shifted with the rhythm of breath, and in the far corner, a chair waited beside a desk where a single candle had already been lit. No matches, no wax drips, just flame, steady and blue. Eleanor sat, opened her book, and began to write. Not the past, not the ghosts, but the beginnings of something older than curses, older than grief, a seed of story not yet planted in soil. She wrote the first line slowly, letting it bloom. Every house remembers. Behind her, a floorboard sighed. Somewhere upstairs, a door unlatched. But Eleanor didn't look up. The pen moved like it had found its purpose again, guided not by fear, not by endings, but by the soft power of a woman who had already faced the grave and come back carrying its silence like a lantern. Outside, the forest leaned in, the wind curled around the house, and the earth beneath it exhaled, as if relieved to be named. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, subscribe for more haunting mysteries, and hit that bell so you never miss the next case.